right? It's okay. It's okay for us to make a certain level of income if they're still eating with us. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
As soon as you start cutting off, they money, then they integrated everything but the money. They always talk about integration. They integrated everything but the resources and the money.
well, that's when they start changing laws, right? And that's where like one of my favorite books comes into play. The whole idea of powernomics, right? Is using the capital that we get to buy the influence. It's something else we mentioned. So we were talking about like books or what have you that let off. I mean, I knew this was going to be a long conversation because brother Akil, like we could go for days talking to him. But the thing is though, Kwame Ture is interesting too, right? I always go back and you ever watch that video when he's walking with like Martin, and like he's giving his opinion and Martin is giving his opinion. Like to me, that's also one of the most courageous moments I saw. Like, because when you read about how Dr. King is revered, and you got this young guy who's like who's going a completely different direction, and he's like sitting in front of him, but he's still being like respectful and like just disagreeing with him on camera. To me, that was like one of the most illest things I think I've ever seen. Like, I'm like, yo, this dude was ill. Yeah, but he was still like, but he was showing him respect, but like completely like disagreeing with him at the same time. I said, that's like, to me, that was like ill. I was like, yo, he's ill.
Because it was partly my study of Kwame Ture that opened my eyes up to what I call the real king, or at least king toward the end of his life. Like the king that king became when the means, okay, we gotta kill him. You know what I mean? Like
when they start talking about when he starts talking about money, when he starts talking about economics, they opened his head up. I mean, they opened, he had to go. Simply because when you, and this is something that me and Jim talked about privately, but I'll put it on our podcast. But when you have that kind of sphere of influence that he had over people, it doesn't really mean anything unless you start talking about the economic empowerment of those people, right? So as long as he was talking about social change, he was fine. As soon as he started talking about economic change, he had to get out of here. Because now when you start talking about empowering hundreds of thousands of millions and millions of people, that right there makes you dangerous, because then our government loses control of those people because they don't control those people's time anymore. Because the more resources you have, the less control they have of your time.
Yeah. Speaking of that, I'm glad you brought that up, because I know we had conversations about the value of time before, and lo and behold, I guess it's like what do they call it, synchronicity or whatever. I was tutoring a young sister tonight, and she had a workbook she had a workbook she had to complete for the summertime in order to get her to help get ready for like the 7th grade. So it was a particular problem that we went over, and it tied into that concept. And I'm gonna read the problem to you, and I'm gonna tell you a little bit about like the type of conversation we had. So the problem was, it was number 4 on this particular page. And we were doing an exercise with like the coordinate plane and the different grid and the points. We were talking about salary. So it was cool before I even get to this question, because it was cool because then I was like, it's like, when a lot of times when we teach math is real abstract, because it's just, equations, X's and Y's and numbers, and with no real life application. But what has to happen is it has to be, in order for it to be effective, it's got to be a narrative attached to it, where you really tell a story about like, okay, like what's the value of these numbers? So we end up having this conversation about salary versus hourly employees. We start talking about what overtime means, how to calculate that. How do you calculate time and a half? How do you calculate double time? Then when does that happen? Or like, or as an employee, you're an hourly employee, and then a supervisor comes to you and says, well, you know what, we're thinking of promoting you, and then you're going to be salaried. And then I was telling the sister, I was like, listen, you got to know how to do the mathematics, because a lot of times you might end up making less money, but they'll gas you up and tell you like, you'll get more credit, more prestige, more credibility. You'll get to wear a uniform, different color uniform shirt. You'll have authority.
But they ain't giving you no more money. They give you anything but money. And
you might make less money actually, like, depending on how the numbers work out. And then, same thing with like sales jobs versus, sometimes you're in a sales position where it's like the sky's the limit, or, you could be the salary manager, you know what I'm saying? So it was cool because, and she's sitting there like, she like, kind of in awe, like I can tell she's never had this conversation before. And I think like that's the power of mathematics, because mathematics kind of puts all that into perspective. And then you kind of just let the young people know, like, listen, like, if you don't know, like, we also use it as a way to like explain how America operates. America is set up, it's a bunch of robbers and thieves, and somebody will try to outsmart you or rob you or exploit you in some kind of way at every corner. And if you can't protect yourself against that, then they're going to get you. And the thing is, they'll smile in your face while they're doing it. And if you don't know no better, because you can't do the calculations, you can't defend yourself against it. You know what I'm saying? So we was talking about all that. But then the number 4, this is what I wanted to get to. Number 4 from the worksheet said, how many hours, because the brother in the program problem, his name was Marshall, right? So it said, how many hours will Marshall have to work if he is saving to buy a $300 game system, right? Now, we already calculated that from number 1, we had to calculate how much his hourly wage was. It was $7.50. So now, boom, this opens the door. Now we can have a conversation about your point, which is time. Like, so now it's not, because money is real abstract. Like money, like what does $300 even mean? What does $1,000 even mean? Like, what does that mean? But what's not abstract is how many hours of my life that I have to spend to do that I cannot get back. Mm-hmm. I can't get them hours back. You can get robbed and go make the money again, get the money back. But time in your life, you can't get that back. And you're making a sacrifice because you could have spent that time doing anything. You could have spent it with family, could have spent it with friends, you could have spent it sleeping, you could have spent it, doing a lot of stuff. You could have spent it.
Whatever you want, basically. Yeah.
But a math problem like that puts it in perspective, and you start to have these conversations with the youth. It's like, because they might want to pay a $900 Balenciagas for the prom or whatever. And you say their mom and dad might say, well, shit, you want them, go get a job and go save up for them. And I mean, we're dealing with, dialectical materialism, like everything is good and bad at the same time. So on the one hand, it's like, okay, I respect your grind. I respect your quote unquote hustle, that you were able to, secure employment, and you went to work, you were consistent, you were responsible, and you saved the $900 for a pair of shoes. But then we got to also think about, well, how many hours of your life
did you give away for $900?
For $900. So the cost of the shoe is not just the $900. The cost of the shoe is hours of your life and minutes of your life that you cannot get back. And then you have to ask yourself, like, was that worth it?
Yeah. And I think that, and that's the thing about luxury items or what have you, is because when we look at them, we're not looking at a price tag. We're looking at the time it takes to get that. Right. and Corey always often talk. And by the way, for those out there, we also wrote the book Own Your Time and Space, written by myself and Corey. And Corey goes into the detail.
I still need to get a copy of that.
I got you. Corey goes into detail. One of the things he says that I find interesting, because he writes the part about time, I write about space, but is how we all don't live the same 24 hours, right? So if you have resources, your 24 hours looks different than someone who doesn't have resources.
Right.
And when we look at things that are luxury, so if you take yourself back to being a teenager, you see someone with the new Jordans and the new Balenciagas, like what you're looking at is like how much time it takes to get that. Like that, because that's the only thing that's valuable is our time, right? Our time has so much value to it that we're like, yo, if you're able to get this, that, and the third, like you have more time than me. Like, yeah, like you.
It does, and what people will do is draw a level of respect, based on the amount of time it takes to buy something, right? Because that's what price tells you. Price says, if I give you $100,000 price tag, and you can afford that, that means that you were so efficient with your time that you were able to afford something that costs $100,000. And if I can't afford it, then and people will base their, so what I talk about in the book that you just put up is, if I call you a janitor or if I call you a CEO, right? People will base how they talk to you based on the time that it takes to become either one of those things, right?
Yeah.
People will say it didn't take a lot of time to become a janitor, but it took him forever to become a CEO, not knowing whether or not that man got, put in that position as a CEO without having to do anything to get that position. And it took me more time to get that job as a janitor. Right. And it doesn't say how well either one of those people do their job. And it doesn't say how well either one of those people will treat you.
Well, that goes back to the overall theme of marketing, right? So marketing is about, it kind of like tells us what the value, right? So one of the things, and here's a little tip for people out there, like, so everyone knows I'm in the real estate game, right? So one of the things I learned to do is, if I'm applying for a loan at a bank or something, to do any sort of investment or development, I started including a resume, right? which they don't even ask for. I just add it. Like, so that sometimes you could add a bio, and I add a resume and put that I have a master's degree in real estate, right? And that actually helps. And I've had like lenders tell me like, oh, you have that, because what they're looking at is the time it took me to get that. Our degrees are a measurement of time.
That's all they are.
When you look at someone that's having a bachelor's degree or even you could do a PhD or you know, you put a level of respect based upon the time you think it took them to get that, right? Which is why some people get upset at, like, I know people who hate people with like honorary degrees. They be like, he got an honorary degree
because they didn't put the time behind it.
Because they feel like they didn't put that time in, right? You know what I mean? Because, you know, so
they're not even mad at the degree. They don't care about the degree. They're not mad at the person for the degree. They mad at that they put the time in and the other person didn't have to put any time into it.
Yeah, but that's what it all boils down. All boils down to time, man.